So why did Jesus need to die? Ask most people today what they make of Jesus' crucifixion, and for most people it's a tragic end to a promising life. People even thought that back when it happened. Yet the night before Jesus was killed, there was a woman who came and poured expensive perfume over Jesus. She saw what no one else saw, that his death would be the most powerful act of love ever. Welcome to Discover Week 6. It's our last look at Mark's Gospel, and as we look at chapters 14 to 16, we will be drawing all the threads together. So far we have seen how Jesus is God's Son, filled with God's Spirit, come to bring God's new world, and yet he first must die on the cross. And so in this last week we are going to answer the really big question of Mark's Gospel. So why did Jesus need to die? So why did Jesus need to die? The great climax of Mark's Gospel is Jesus' death on the cross. As Mark tells us what happened, so he wants us to see that God's Son was dying to bring God's new world. In chapters 11 to 13, Jesus has spent the week in the temple teaching and showing that he will return in power and glory, and so judgment was coming. The religious and political leaders, though, don't like Jesus' claims one bit. They want him dead. And although Jesus remains in complete control of what was happening, events start moving quickly. Chapter 14 begins. Now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. So Jesus calls the 12 disciples together to eat the Passover meal, and he uses the bread and the wine to explain the meaning of his death. Back in week 3, we saw that Jesus had come to lead a new Exodus rescue, and like the first Exodus, this one begins with a Passover. And so from the bread and wine, see the double meaning of Jesus' death. Firstly, the wine. Jesus must die to free us. Back at the time of the first Exodus, God's people Israel were slaves in the land of Egypt under the Pharaoh. But God promised to rescue his people, and so he brought plague after plague on the Egyptians to force them to set his people free. As a last resort, God warns Pharaoh that there would be one last plague which would set his people free. In one night, God would pass through the land, and in every household the firstborn son would die. God was coming in judgment to claim what belonged to him. Yet God also gave a way that any household could escape death. A household was to take a lamb and adopt it as a pet. It would live with them, and then they were to kill it, eat it, and paint its blood around the doorposts of their house. And then, when the Lord came in judgment through the land of Egypt, he would pass over any house with blood on the doorposts. Can you imagine what it would have felt like to be an eldest son that night? I'm an eldest son, and I would be saying to Dad, Dad, have you really made sure you have painted blood all round the doorposts? For that night, in every household there would be a death. Either the death of the firstborn son, or a death of the Passover lamb. The lambs were dying in the place of the sons. And God did this so that he could claim the people of Israel as his own without them having to die. Ever since, the people celebrated the Passover meal to remember that night God rescued them. And as Jesus eats the Passover meal with his disciples, the big question is, where is the lamb? And the answer is that Jesus is the true Passover lamb. That's why he takes a cup of wine, and verse 24 says, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." God's own Son, is the true Passover lamb because he dies in the place of his followers to rescue us from a world under Satan's control and to claim us for God forever. We owe our lives to God, and yet God's Son pays what we owe so that we can belong to God. His blood is the blood of the covenant because his death means that I can be adopted into God's family. That's the big message of Mark's Gospel, that God's Son joined us in our mess so that we can join him in God's family forever. And that mission took Jesus to his death. Yet Jesus must not just die in our place, he must die bearing God's exile judgment in our place. At the time of the Exodus, God comes and claims the people of Israel as his own. Yet over the centuries, in their hearts, they keep turning away from him. And as a last resort, God says that Jerusalem and the temple would be destroyed and his people taken off into exile. It would be a strike at the heart of his own people to change their hearts. Last time we saw how Jesus warned that the final judgment was going to begin early with the destruction of the temple. It would be the ultimate exile judgment. And now in chapter 14 we see just how soon this would begin. As Jesus goes into the Garden of Gethsemane, so he prays, and he sees that he must drink the cup. That's a Bible way of talking about the exile judgment that the people of Israel had to drink. But now it's God's Son who will drink it all. God's exile judgment was about to fall, and it would fall not on us, but on Jesus on the cross. It would be a strike at the very heart of God's own people, not just on the temple, but on God himself. We saw in week 3 how all our hearts are far from God, and so we do so much hurt to one another. Imagine this book is a record of all the hurt I've caused. It sits so heavily on me because I know that God's judgment is coming on my life. Yet Jesus comes along and says, I'll take responsibility for that. And so all the weight of my wrong sits on him. He pays for it all in advance. And as he willingly accepts God's judgment for my wrong, so in him is the healing power to wash my heart clean and make it new. It's a bit like there is a deadly virus sweeping through the world, and Jesus says, inject it into me. He fights the virus in his body and overcomes it. And then he says, use my blood as the cure. We saw in week 3 how Jesus has the power to make our hearts new. And now we see that that power comes from him dying in our place. He does what is so against human nature. We play down and excuse our evil. But Jesus fully and willingly accepts God's judgment on all our evil in our place. So in him is the cure that our hearts need. And so the blood of Jesus guarantees that no matter what I've done, no matter who I am, all my wrong has been paid for, my heart has been made new, and God has adopted me into his family forever. That's the heart of the cross, that the judge swaps places with me, that he takes the judgment in my place, so that God can free me, make me new, and claim me as his own. Secondly, the bread. Jesus must die to feed us. At the first Passover, the people were told to bake bread without yeast. This was because they had to get out of Egypt quickly, and there was no time to wait for the bread to rise. And so unleavened bread became the symbol of new life with God. It was a symbol of the bread that would feed them on their journey from Egypt through the wilderness and into the promised land. So verse 22, while they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, take it, this is my body. Jesus was claiming to be the true unleavened bread. Jesus' body given in death for his people is the bread his people must feed on. As we saw in week 4, the journey that Jesus must lead us on is the way of the cross. Through life, we are to trust God as we give ourselves in self-giving love to others, no matter what the cost is to ourselves. We also saw, though, how this is impossible for us. But now we see how Jesus' death makes the impossible possible. And that's because he first walks the way of the cross in the ultimate way. Chapters 14 and 15 stress that he goes to the cross alone. Despite being innocent, he gives his life to pay for all our wrong. It's the ultimate example of trusting God in self-giving love. And as God's Son, filled with God's Spirit, only he can do this. But now, by his Spirit, he can enable us to follow him in his footsteps. Remember the illustration of the needle and the thread. Jesus is the needle who first goes down and up and pulls us, the thread, behind him. We can go the way of the cross because he first walked the way of the cross. And so Jesus is the bread we need to feed our hearts on our journey. Of course, his body is not physical food, but spiritual food. We saw in week 2 how Jesus' teaching is the food our hearts need. And as we keep feeding on his teaching, so we will grow and grow and produce fruit for God. What chapter 14 adds is that his teaching can do that in us because the power his words come with is the power of his obedience to death, even on a cross. So this is the double meaning of Jesus' death. Jesus dies so God can free us from this world under his judgment, and so that God can feed us through this life as we journey into his new world. Jesus' death gives us complete confidence of our forever future. Yes, we must grow up in our faith to take up our place in his new world. Yet we grow by our hearts daily feeding on the power of Jesus' death. And we will keep feeding on Jesus because Jesus died to also give us a new heart that wants to keep feeding on him. Jesus' death already has done it all. And so all our hope is in him. Christianity is Christ. Jesus is like a bank account that God opened long before we were born. In Jesus, because of his death, God has deposited a vast sum of money so that we would have everything we need in the Christian life, and so that we can have complete confidence that our forever future has already 100% been paid for up front. So the cross is the staggering message of God's love for us. No wonder the woman poured expensive perfume over Jesus. However, the 12 disciples are blind to what Jesus is saying. They are blind because they still don't accept their hearts are far from God. Jesus says to them, "It is one of you who will betray me." But they couldn't accept it could be them. Each in turn says, "Surely he doesn't mean me." And then Jesus says they will all flee from him when he's arrested. But Peter insists that he will never deny Jesus. Yet that very night he will deny Jesus 3 times. They are blind to their hearts, and so they're blind to the cross. They just don't get why Jesus must die. And so as Mark finishes his gospel, he wants to show us and open our hearts to see why Jesus had to die. It's in chapter 15 that he actually tells us of the crucifixion of Jesus, and his focus is not on the physical sufferings, but on the meaning of what was happening. And so Mark asks each of us, do you see or are you blind? And so let me finish Discover by asking you 4 questions about what you see. Firstly, do you see that Jesus was killed by us all? between the Passover and the cross are two trials. Both are sham trials, and both show us that Jesus was actually innocent of all charges. The first was the Jewish court, and the second was the court of the Roman Empire, but both condemned Jesus to death. Mark is wanting us to see that the whole world wants Jesus dead. Unless we think that doesn't include us, Mark tells us of the crowd chanting, "Crucify him, crucify him." If we don't hear our own voice in that crowd, then we don't know our own heart, given the chance you and I would do what they did. And unless we see that our hearts are that far from God, we will never get Jesus and why he had to die for us. Mark is asking each of us, do you see or are you blind? Secondly, do you see that Jesus was revealing God? Jesus dies a criminal's death. He's killed at Golgotha, which means place of a skull. It's where criminals were executed. The Roman writer Cicero wrote about crucifixion. It is the most cruel and shameful of punishments. Let it never come near the body of a Roman citizen. Indeed, let it never come near his thoughts or eyes or ears, or let the word pass from his lips. For the people there, as Jesus hung on the cross dying, he did not look like God's Son at all. Yet it was the moment that Jesus was most openly revealing God. You want to know what God is really like? Then look at the cross. There, God's heart is cut open, and what we see is self-giving love. In week 2, we saw that Jesus teaches in parables because God hides himself, and now we see that the ultimate parable is the cross itself. There, God hides himself in this most public event in history. It's why Mark's account is full of so much mocking that's actually the truth. Before crucifying him, we're told that the soldiers put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him, and they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. As Jesus is crucified, a sign is put above his head, the King of the Jews. This is the moment when the king is crowned. Yet his throne is a cross, and his crown a crown of thorns. But all who are there are totally blind to who he really is. All they can do is to mock and insult him. They cry out, "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe." They think they can see, but how blind they are. In front of their very eyes, on the cross, is their Messiah, the Lord God of Israel. This is staggering love, that my Creator should step down from heaven into this messed up world and let himself be crucified by the people he had made, and yet in dying, rescue us forever. The message of the cross is that we are more wicked than we have ever realised, but we are more loved than we have ever dreamed. And Mark asks each of us, do you see or are you blind? Thirdly, do you see that Jesus was bringing us to God? At the climax of the crucifixion, Mark wants us to see that God's new rescue was happening. The darkness in the middle of the day shows us that God's final judgment was beginning. The cry of Jesus, my God, why have you forsaken me?" shows us that the judgment was falling on him. And the curtain of the temple ripping in two shows us that the way into God's presence is now open. Because Jesus has taken the judgment in our place, so the wall between us and God has gone. The exile can end and a new relationship with God can begin. At the foot of the cross, everyone there is blind and deaf to what is happening. Of all people, only Jesus' executioner sees. Verse 39, And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." He must have seen many men die, but this was different. Mark is asking each of us, do you see or are you blind? Fourthly, do you see that Jesus was raised as our new hope? Mark's Gospel finishes by showing us that Jesus didn't stay dead, but was raised 3 days later. It's the early hours of the morning, and some of the women who had followed Jesus are making their way to the tomb where his body had been laid. When they arrive, they find the huge stone used to seal the tomb had been hurled to one side, and they meet a young man dressed in white, a messenger from heaven, and he says to them, "Don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Again and again, Jesus had taught that he must suffer and die, and then 3 days later rise again. He was teaching that the only way into God's new world is the way of the cross. And so Mark wants us to see that Jesus was raised as our new hope. As C.S. Lewis wrote, "Jesus has forced open a door that has been locked since the death of the first man. He has met, fought, and beaten the king of death. Everything is different because he has done so." Jesus' resurrection is the proof that God's new world really is coming. The old has died in his death, and the new rises in his resurrection. Now we can even face death itself without fear. The disciples, though, had fled in fear when Jesus had been arrested, and now even the women who had stayed watching Jesus die flee in fear. It feels abrupt, but this is how Mark ends his gospel. He could have given us loads more evidence for the resurrection, and you get that in the other gospels. But it's like Mark deliberately wants to leave us on a cliffhanger. What will happen next? Will the women see and believe? What about the disciples? And surely Mark does this because he wants to throw those questions back to us. Will we see and believe that the only way into God's new world is the way of the cross? Or will we stay blind and deaf? What's at stake is whether we will keep following Jesus through the challenges of this life and to let him bring us into God's new world forever. What happens next is over to you.